before we get into it, we need to issue a correction.
Yes.
Or maybe it's not a correction, but it's at least a footnote.
An update.
An update. Because in the last episode, we talked for a little while about the Museum of Natural History in New York City, and specifically the Northwest Coast Wing, where the indigenous people of the Northwest Coast were represented in, or are still, in the Museum of Natural History, the wing that was curated, organized by Franz Boas, going back over 100 years. And how when we visited, we thought it was like a little musty and dated, and maybe it was in need of some renovation. Well, I learned after we recorded that it has in fact been renovated. And maybe there's probably those of you out there who know this already, and maybe you were like screaming about it the whole time you were hearing us talk. But we've learned this now, that the Northwest Coast Wing was closed for like 5 years, and it underwent a long renovation, and
they cleaned up the costumes and stuff and the artifacts, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't just like an architectural renovation. I think that it seems like the presentation of all of the artifacts and everything has changed, and one of the participants was a member of one of the First Nations from the territory that is being represented, and that's about all I know. But I think it reopened last year, so it's open again now. I don't know if I'll ever see it, but I would like to compare it to what we saw.
Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of our discussion of Chapter 5 many seasons ago. When we left off, we were discussing the cultural differences between the various tribes of the Pacific Northwest and those of California, or what is now called California, further south. And we were particularly discussing the concept of schismogenesis as a factor in their cultural distinctions when we were finishing up that episode.
Yeah, the cultures of the Northwest having this like lavish, opulent, maybe even ostentatious type of culture. And then the cultures of the South seeming to express like almost an opposite ethos that at least one anthropologist described as almost like a Protestant ethos. And the idea that these cultures are maybe like defining themselves against each other is what the Davids are proposing. But what they want to do is, after introducing these two cultures and, kind of laying the groundwork, they want to take us through what could be some possible explanations for the stark differences between the cultures, and along the way to make a case for their specific explanation, right? But they're gonna like be evaluating some different ideas along the way. And right at the start of this, they come right out and hypothesize that slavery is actually the key to understanding the differences between the two cultures.
Yeah, and they also point out here that the fact that there was pretty entrenched slavery in the societies of the Northwest is not treated very often within the field of anthropology. Like, there are some people who talk about it, but it's also almost avoided, is their insinuation. And they think that that's actually obfuscating one of the main determining factors in the various forms of the cultural distinctions between the groups.
Yeah, the Northwest Coast cultures are like what they're talking about here as the Northwest Coast cultures. So this would be maybe like the Coast Salish and the Kwakwaka'wakw and maybe the Haida and some of these other ones that are all kind of lumped together in this book, for better or for worse, had the institution of like basically chattel slavery, where slaves were property. And the descendants of slaves would also be enslaved.
Yes.
Would continue to be enslaved, right?
Yes.
Like, this is a very
codified form of slavery.
Yeah, this is one of the more, I don't know, is extreme the right word, but it's like one of the more oppressive forms of slavery, perhaps the most.
I would say rigid, too. Like, you can't buy your way out of it. You can't work your way out of it.
Right.
You are just that for your life, and your offspring are that, and their offspring are that, unless they escape.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And chattel slavery is the form of slavery that was practiced in what would become the United States and also the United States of America, right? So the enslavement of captured Africans and their descendants.
Well, and importantly, you know, it's not only that I didn't know that about those groups, but also that the level, you can read it, but then to actually look at the numbers, like sometimes up to a fourth of the population would be enslaved people. Yeah,
they say that like the observations of the culture from back then suggest that, and I didn't trace this down, but suggest that, like up to or around 25% of the population would be these enslaved captives. Roughly similar to the percentage of the population in the American South under slavery, or the percentage of the Athenian population of slaves, or like the Roman slaves or something. So like about that proportion. I don't know why that proportion is something that in all different times and places becomes a common proportion. But
importantly, that number, one thing they point out later in the chapter is that 25%, the quarter of the population being enslaved, is so foundational to the economy that it's not only the aristocrats, but all the commoners whose lives are built upon that institution.
Yeah. So slavery was a big part of the Northwest Coast culture and was relatively absent in the Californian sphere. They do say that in Northwest California, there was enslavement to some small extent, but like nothing like the institutionalized foundation of society that it was in the Northwest. So they want to dig into this phenomenon of slavery and, you know, the existence of it in one sphere and the relative non-existence of it in the other, because they're proposing that maybe this tells us something important about how these cultures were different in all the other ways as well. And the first thing that they want to do is talk about, you know, how far back does the slavery go in the Northwest Coast, because it's always possible that maybe the Europeans who were reporting on this were just seeing something that was maybe like relatively recent, or possibly even like an artifact of colonization or something, right? Because this happens sometimes, is that stuff that is identified by Europeans that are happening in indigenous society is actually kind of an effect of colonization to begin with, you know, and so it's wrong to project it further into the past. So they spend a little time investigating into that. And according to them, evidence that is suggestive of enslavement goes pretty far back. Like they actually trace this back to 1850 BC, like roughly, in a period that anthropologically is called the Middle Pacific period. And that's about the time that you first see evidence for the bulk harvesting of salmon and other anadromous fish. And coincidentally, maybe not, who knows, you know, around that same time, if I am reading the text correctly, you start to see also the burials that are subsequent to that start showing signs of like burials of people of very different status. You know, so some people who have like rich burials, obviously with a lot of like ceremony and care, and then the burials of people whose like bodies have been mutilated or were otherwise just not cared for in death.
Yeah, and also just to say, besides the digs and the archaeological evidence, there's also the evidence of oral tradition and history, and the people who interviewed indigenous folks in those areas at that time of contact have recorded that in their living tradition history, no one remembered a time before the system of slavery was in place.
Okay.
So that being passed down, you know, that was definitely part of their story as a people by that time.
Okay. So with that established, they want to talk a little bit about like the meaning of slavery in order to unpack this as a phenomenon that is in discussion in these ethnographies. And one thing that I thought was interesting about this part in the book is that they pull their definition of slavery almost directly from Orlando Patterson, the like Jamaican American scholar, who is the theorist of the concept of social death.
Right.
and who's been like a major resource for the Afro-pessimist thinkers. The definition that comes from Orlando Patterson, or that like is associated with him, is not this like more conventional definition that has to do with a enslaved person being like legal property, right? Like most definitions of slavery focus on the fact of
being owned
of the property relation.
Right.
But his definition is that what defines being enslaved is the inability to create or maintain any kind of social ties, right? So the slave cannot have friends in like a meaningful way, like in the sense of having commitments or making promises, entering into any kind of agreements, right? The enslaved person is removed from the possibility of having meaningful social ties. And they talk about how the word friend is actually cognate with the word for free, right? So free means to be able to be a friend or have friends. And so this is like a powerful kind of reorientation for like a lot of us, at least anyway, of what it means to be enslaved in this sense.
Yeah, and one only need to look at the practice of buying and selling people in the Southeast during, especially in the era after the Atlantic slave trade was banned, and breeding and disrupting families was so much a part of the practice of plantation wealth distribution and movement, because people were just moved around so much and families were broken up constantly, you know. And so you can see that like people still managed to have social ties, but you could only say you had very little control over where your person might end up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think, I mean, we should probably, in case this sounds like counterintuitive or just false, like, it's not that an enslaved person would literally say, like, I have no friends or something, you know, but it's like the property relation and the social construction of their position meant that they don't have self-determination to the point that they can actually, like, make promises and keep them and, like, enact the material basis of friendship because the autonomy is lacking.
Right.
You know? And so that was a really powerful and influential theorization by Orlando Patterson. And this isn't just an aside in this book. It actually becomes part of the foundation for the Davids. Like they have this ongoing, and it really takes a few steps forward in this chapter. They have this like ongoing theorization of power relations and domination starting from caring relations and being a perversion of and a distortion of caring relations. And this definition of slavery as a form of social death and like an appropriation of care, part of the foundation for that they're going to go on to theorize in the book is this definition coming from Orlando Patterson. So I thought that was cool that they are like resting it in the work of this theorist in the Black radical tradition.
Definitely.
Yeah. So there's a section that comes after this called Concerning the Nature of Slavery and, quote, Modes of Production, unquote, more generally. And remember, they're still looking for like an explanation for why the Northwest Coast people might have had slaves, and then especially also why they did, but the Californian neighbors did not. And what this section seems to mostly be about is they want to discard the idea that it was the Northwest Coast people's, quote, mode of production that may have determined their usage of slave labor. And a mode of production, you might remember this if you listen to our Caliban and the Witch season, but modes of production refer to ways that like an economy of a culture is basically organized, like production as in generally the production of the material necessities, you know, for the culture. And so we live now under a capitalist mode of production. in Europe before capitalism was largely a feudal mode of production.
Yeah, and I guess like in prehistory, there was like hunting modes of production. There would be people who had like more fishing lives, coastal peoples that might do more like maritime economies.
Nomadic game hunting.
Right.
Coastal fishing settlements. And not just in prehistory, but in like people who are living outside of like the history of the development of the West.
Right.
And the colonization Europeans undertook.
Intensified foraging.
Maybe not living outside of it, but, at least up until a certain point, like living outside of it, right? Yeah. So modes of production. And I think part of what the Davids are reacting to is that there can be this way of assigning various cultural phenomenon to like modes of production that are appropriate to it. Like maybe you would hear somebody claim that it wasn't until the dawn of agriculture that you had slavery emerge as an institution because forced labor was needed to like do all the labor in the fields or something. So there's like a reason, right? Like a materialist reason. It's like, oh, all of a sudden the controllable labor needs have increased. And so now it encourages slavery. And we have like a priest class that needs to get fed without working, whatever, right? So this would be like a materialist analysis of the emergence of agriculture where you're like, this is where slavery belongs. It's with this, stage in evolution. Or
within the plantation system of the colonial era, then as a means of primitive accumulation, so that if we want to refer back to Caliban, right, that it's like this was needed for capitalism to launch, I do want to say here that this contribution is one of the big ones for the book for a lot of people. Like a lot of folks who read this take note of this chapter and the example of these foragers who have chattel slavery. Because I think a lot of us identify that institution strictly with the American South. And a lot of people think that it's a plantation situation that requires that, know? And so they're actually, this is helpful in a couple of ways because it not only shakes up our ideas about what's the history of the world and the history of peoples, but also troubles people's notions of the purity of indigenous life.
Right.
And so a lot of folks are like, oh, wait, what?
Yeah.
That's weird. That's not how I conceptualize like living in harmony with nature, which is like the idealized version of indigenous folks.
Right. Yeah. And they're not a grain state.
Right.
Right. So like maybe even in the indigenous Americas, you might be less surprised to see slavery in one of these like very top heavy imperial grain
empires.
States or, kind of empires or whatever, like Aztec or something like that. But this was not that.
Right.
Either, but yet still they had slaves. And
they had chattel slavery. Yeah. I mean, even that institution itself is just so different from so many forms of enslavement through history,
Yeah. But here, the Davids are kind of preempting the materialist argument that would say, like, well, they were incentivized to have slaves because of something related to their mode of production, of like the way that they were gathering and utilizing food or something like that. And the way they want to preempt that argument is by relying on this Brazilian anthropologist named Fernando Santos Granero, who has a book called Vital Enemies that's all about Amerindian slavery, where he analyzes instantiations of slavery in the Americas, north to south, all the way among indigenous peoples. And one of the things that he documents is that the modes of production of people who kept slaves are just all over the map. You had nomadic hunter-gatherers who kept slaves. You had settled agricultural people. You had coastal settled fishing people or semi-nomadic fishing people like the Kwakwakwa. It was all over the place. And so that kind of like destroys the idea that slavery, that you can like just correlate the slavery that you see with a specific mode of production. Well, it's not surprising that they had slaves because they had this mode. And in fact, the Davids use this as an excuse to question the whole concept of modes of production in general and whether these are like useful categories, because they observe, that sometimes nomadic people like live off of some other people's agriculture.
Right.
And so what does that say about your mode of production? when you're not actually producing anything, you're just stealing.
Right.
Right. And to them, this makes the whole concept of modes of production seem really naive, is the word that they use, or just, kind of useless.
Right. It's all or nothing over here.
Yeah, it's kind of all or nothing,
Yeah.
And when I see this type of move that they're making, I'm kind of like, okay, because of the all or nothingness of the way that they analyze so many of these things, because I think it's actually quite possible that analyzing the Kwakiutl mode of production could give us some useful tidbits of information as to why they had the institution of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think that the Davids kind of do this
Right.
a little bit eventually. The fact that you had like a harvest season.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost like the harvest season in a grain state or something,
Right.
where you had a harvest season where a lot of labor was required to pull in the harvest, to process it, to put it into storage, and then you had stored wealth.
Mm-hmm.
That had to be portioned out and administered, and all of these things might have something to do with it.
Right.
But that can be true without the Kwak 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 or some of these other Amerindian people neatly falling into a very clear typology of this type of culture that predicts this type of behavior or this type of thing, right? So we have this thing where it's there's these patterns that anthropologists have identified, and the patterns have a certain amount of utility, but then they don't capture everything, and there comes a point where you have to look beyond the patterns and actually examine things with a finer lens.
Right.
And that need, to me, does not necessarily repudiate the framework entirely, necessarily.
Right, and maybe I think also they're always pushing back against the linear progression that can come along with modes of production.
Yeah.
And we might question that too and say that intensified forager societies, or whatever, we want to call them, the Fisher Kings, are not necessarily on their way to a state.
Yeah.
Or, and in this case, it very much not so,
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And so holding, seeing that maybe you can accept that those categories of how people live and sustain their lives can be useful for some things. Don't explain everything.
Yeah.
But that we don't also want to accept that linear evolutionary theory that goes along with it sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good way to kind of meet in the middle.
Right.
Bring them both together. Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to say is just that this problem of having a framework where you're doing some pattern recognition and you're having some categories, but you also admit that it's an imperfect map of the world as it is very normal and familiar. We talk about this in our herbal medicine school pretty much right at the beginning, because we teach people ways of talking about, there's all kinds of ways, but one is we have this concept of tissue states, where in the body you can say that an organ or a tissue in the body is experiencing excitation, stagnation, atrophy, depression. We have these tissue states, and there's 6 of them. And we teach our students this framework, but at the same time, we have to remind people right at the beginning that the map is not the territory, that these concepts are useful to the extent that they are useful. And that another quote that we throw in is that all models are wrong. That's what it is, right? It's from a statistician. I forget his name. All models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Right.
And so these kind of reminders that come in the form of these aphorisms are reminders that of 2 things. Of one, that the models that we form to understand reality are always deficient and never perfectly map the territory. The only perfect map of the territory is just 1-to-1 with the territory itself.
Right.
So a map is not useful if it's not reduced and simplified from the territory itself.
Right.
And so they're wrong in the sense that they don't capture exactly what's going on perfectly, but they're also useful in that a simplified framework is useful for helping us think, or in the sense of a map, helping us navigate.
Right.
Right. And so when you find something that kind of doesn't quite neatly fit into the categories that you have defined in your map, it doesn't necessarily mean that the map is now become useless.
Right.
You know, but what I'm pointing out now also does not mean that maps should never be thrown out or should never be revised.
Right.
Yes, like we're always revising our theories, our models, our maps as well. And so, you know, maybe what the Davids are proposing here is partially like that we need a better map.
Right.
You know, but they're not really, I don't think they're really offering us necessarily a better map. Sometimes they seem to be like against categories in general.
Right.
They're like, let's get rid of all these categories. You know.
Well, I mean, I think that most of us who work with any model or system or map know people who do rigidly hold onto the system.
Yeah.
And categories and framing, and if something doesn't fit in there, it's just wrong. You know. Or like a lot of the emergent over the past few decades science on same-sex coupling within animals, you know, they point to how forever there were all these examples coming up of that happening.
Yeah.
But the individuals would be considered aberrations or weird and unusual, even though it was always there.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so there is the thing where scientists of all kinds in all fields will throw out what doesn't fit the map or the system.
Yeah.
You know, and so just to say that there are always going to be people who hold on too tight on one end and think everything has to fit in the box. And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with the thing, not the box.
Right.
But there will, on the other end, there's going to be people who are just like, fuck categories.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Right.
And so don't see the usefulness of those models.
Right.
And then once again, we're saying we're more in the middle in identifying some usefulness here.
Right.
While also understanding some limitations.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, right. Oh, God, what you just said is making me want to go on a whole tangent, kind of. Because one thing that is often true is that the examples that are coming up repeatedly as exceptions, but that maybe should not be seen as exceptions, but also maybe part of the norm.
Right.
They are simultaneously, by their very existence, redrawing the map, but also can, to some extent, be accounted for using knowledge that was already developed.
Right.
So it's not that they're completely outlying thing.
Right.
Yeah. I'm thinking the tangent that I'm trying to resist going on is the recent Radiolab podcast episode where they're talking about the lesbian seagulls.
Quote unquote lesbian.
Yeah, quote unquote lesbian seagulls. Or like the female pairs of seagulls that raised their eggs together and formed pairs. And then like the impulse to say like, oh my God, gay animals, you know, in kind of like a final sense. But then the revelation towards the end of that episode that there's actually another material process.
What I'm thinking of more, and also you just didn't even give a spoiler alert before you told the end of the episode of the Radiolab.
Yeah, I might even cut that part out. I might even cut that part out. So that is the main argument. But then, as they segue out from this section, they actually make a very bold claim, which is going to pop back up in the book in a different form. But they observe about how historically, and including in Amerindian capturing societies documented by Santos Granero, enslaved people are often compelled into caring relations, like braiding the hair of the elite classes, or like feeding people for sure, but also bathing people, like decorating them, like doing all kinds of care work. And this is like so typical of the institution of slavery, they argue, that we can usefully observe that for many enslaved people historically, the product of their labor has been the creation of a certain kind of person. An elite kind of person, right? Because if you're not really this like upper class, high status, elite type of person, unless you have your hair done in a certain way and like your skin decorated in a certain way, or like your clothes be a certain way, or that you're elevated on like carried on a litter and not allowed for your feet to touch the ground, or all these things that we've seen, you know, that we see not necessarily in Quack Quack Quack, but like around the world in all these different situations. If that is what marks your status, you know, then the enslaved people are creating you as a person of that status. That is actually the product of their labor.
And it is their work that allows there to be this leisure class, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a production of a certain kind of person, is where they take this at the end. And then they follow this up with the declaration that, like, they basically say, like, and so if it's not obvious to you yet, this is exactly where we need to look to understand the origins of domination. It is in the institution of slavery, and in particular, this like appropriation and coercion of caring labor in the institution of slavery. This is the origin of domination.
Hierarchy starts at home.
Yeah, which is very freaking, this is bold claim, you know, which at this point, they're not going to make a strong case. They're kind of implying that what we've already said is the case, you know, but it's like a mic drop at this point, and they're going to come back to it later.
Well, now we're going to talk about another model that they want to talk about and find some flaws with.
Right.
But
that's what we're doing.
That's
right.
what we're doing.
That's right. Yes.
Which is a sort of predictive model that is called optimal foraging theory. And it's a theory that comes actually from observation of animals' foraging practices, non-human animals specifically, more like fish and bees. And the idea is that other species will gather food in the way that makes them expend the least amount of energy. The most efficient foraging possible is what animals do, generally. You know, and I was thinking about, especially with bees, like when we use the expression like to make a beeline for something, it is really true. Like when you watch bees at a beehive, they just like, they have in their minds where they're going to go, and then they're just like directly to it. They're like, the linden tree over here. You know, like they're just like, this tree over here, or like the rose bush, whatever the thing is. You know, I mean, the idea of the beeline is like just this visible metaphor I can think of that is
optimal foraging,
you know, the straight to the thing. Don't waste any time.
Right.
You know, so this concept of optimal foraging as a way to explain behavior is applied to humans by some theorists.
Yeah.
And the idea is that generally humans, being rational creatures, will work out the most efficient means of providing their own sustenance and food, and maybe even create their cultures around that. And if you see a culture that does not seem to have an optimal foraging pattern, then there's some other factor going on, and you need to just figure out what that is to explain it.
Yeah, right. So even within optimal foraging theory is an invitation to other explanations. Because it's like, it sounds like, to me like it's taking as a starting point a pretty common sense notion, right? Which is that like, if your people have an abundance of wild game in the form of like deer and ground birds or whatever around you, then you're probably not going to form your subsistence around hunting for solitary ants under rocks in the ground or something.
Sure.
Right? Because it's just going to take too much work to like get your needs met in that way. And people want to have leisure and they want to have time for other things. And so they're going to want to like get a pretty good return on their investment.
Right.
But that's not what we always see, is like a maximization of return. And so when we don't see that, it invites the question, like, what else is in the picture besides these types of calculations? Right.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that the way that folks applying the optimal foraging theory onto humans, or putting it down onto culture, is sort of explained as that humans tend to have like a cost-benefit analysis in our behavior. And that we're always weighing those things.
That's like Homo economicus is what they call that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine why the Davids are not excited about this particular way of looking at things. And so this is what this next part of the chapter is about, which is like why do people along the west coast of Turtle Island live in such different ways and decide to focus their lives around different forms of nourishment, and what are the choices that are made there? And so what they're discussing here is the fact that South of the Pacific Northwest, the peoples of that large area tended to have a pretty diverse diet compared to the people of the Northwest. And
the people who they're calling the Californians in this book. Yeah.
I'm clearly trying to avoid
or
saying
whatever.
that, but yes. Anyway, the Californians have more of a acorn and tree nut based diet. And as we mentioned in part 1 of this, they also eat like shellfish and hunt deer. It's pretty diverse in a lot of ways. It's not just the nuts and acorns or fish and that's it. Actually, they had a much more diverse diet in many ways. But if you're thinking about it with like caloric intake, fish are obviously superior if we're doing it in a cost-benefit analysis in that they have a lot more nutrition. You also get oil and fat from them for cooking and just for eating and for making medicine. There's just a lot going on with fish and they're in abundance. And with tree nuts, they tend to go in these cycles where some years there'll be huge amounts of them and a big bounty, and then some years there's not. That has to do with the way that trees just work that produce nuts in abundance. They just have off years. Mm-hmm. They take years off. They have their own cost and benefit analysis that they are performing. I don't actually know what all goes into that. There's a lot of theories around that as well, but they do take years off. So you can't always count on them. So the fish are actually more reliable as the Davids are looking at the situation. Also, when they're looking at this comparison within the terms of behavioral ecologists, who are the people who might apply optimal foraging theory to people, certain categories of sustenance are front-loaded as far as work goes. And so it means you have to put in a lot of work at the beginning when you harvest them. Mm. And fish are front-loaded. So when you have to catch a lot of fish, you have to dry them, you have to prepare them in a way that you can keep them around so they don't rot, and you have to render the oil. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of work to do at the beginning, but then it's done. You just have the fish. And acorns and tree nuts are backloaded. So they're pretty easy to harvest. You just gather them and store them, but then when you want to use them, you have to leach them and grind them and do the prep that allows them to be edible. In some cases, pine nuts I think are edible immediately, but acorns require a good bit of work.
Okay, and so front-loaded means that the work is at harvest time.
Right.
That's like the front of the harvest, whatever, right? It means that like you have to do a lot of work at harvest time of the wild resource. Mm-hmm. And backloaded means that the harvest is easy, but then when it's time to consume the thing, that's when you have a lot of work.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
That's how that goes? Okay.
And then I guess this is enough of a conundrum within anthropological circles that some people have, specifically materialist anthropologists, have worked to make some explanation for why you would rely on acorns and nuts instead of fish. Mm-hmm. And one theory that has been posited is that, in the Northwest, it's a very like raiding culture. People steal from each other a lot, or we're stealing from each other a lot and raiding and getting resources. And that they were like, well, acorns and nuts, because they're labor intensive later on, are more raiding proof. They're not going to be looted.
Right.
You know?
Oh, because like, since you have to process your fish right after you harvest them, then like the work is put in before storage.
Right.
And so if you steal someone's stored fish, then you're stealing something that is ready to eat.
Totally.
And that they've already done the work. Mm-hmm. But if you're stealing someone's acorns, then like you still have to do all that grinding and leaching stuff. Yeah. And so it's just there's not as much of an incentive to steal the acorns, because for one thing, they're just already all over the ground. All you have to do is pick them up. You don't need to steal somebody else's, because not much work has been done to put them into storage. And so you're not like stealing that labor.
Right.
Okay, I get it. Yeah.
So that sounds plausible, right? But then the Davids come in and are like, yeah, that's a nice tidy theory you got there. It would be terrible if someone poked some holes in it. And they're like, well, actually, that sounds great, except that the looting and raiding wasn't of fish in the Pacific Northwest. Nobody was taking each other's fish stores. They were actually stealing humans.
Right.
they were capturing societies, but what they were capturing was that vital force, the life force, the worker.
Right. So slavery is back.
So slavery's back, right? And also there's
it's back in the argument.
In the argument,
yeah.
And they've got poked a hole in this theory around that maybe being why you would choose acorns and nuts. But so
right. And the reason why we're even talking about why you would choose, it just has to do with because we're still just talking about why these people are
different from each other.
So different from each other. Maybe all the cultural differences flow from trees down here and fish up here as the primary difference.
Right.
And they're kind of like trying to poke a hole in that.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, they do. So there are some very real material conditions that have nothing to do with raiding or preventing looting.
Yeah.
That are happening on the ground here. And they do point to one, which is that in the Pacific Northwest, which is mostly conifers, but not as much pine, there is not even an option of having an acorn and pine nut based culture or have that even be a large part of your foodstuffs.
Yeah.
There's less options. There's less variation in climates and less microclimates and little different plant communities.
Right.
And so they actually have much less of a choice about basing their life on fish in that place. And the Davids do point that out, but they're...
So like the theory about the front loading and the back loading and what would you rather steal, at the end of that, you might think that to base your life on tree crops is just better.
Right.
Is actually the better choice because now you don't have a front-loaded resource for people to steal.
Right.
And I guess the implication is that, like, if you don't have something that someone's going to steal, then your culture is going to be less war-prone and violent in general.
Yeah.
Right? So that's kind of what they're
that's in there. That's true.
Undermining a little bit.
Yeah.
Because, like, and remember, we talked a few episodes ago about whether you have something to defend being a possible predictor for like patriarchy and all kinds of other institutions. And that argument that has to do with the front loading and back loading of a resource is kind of like, if you have front loaded something, now you have something more valuable in storage than if it's a back loaded thing. And now you have more to invest in defense. And so that could explain war, violent slavery in the culture that stores a front loaded resource.
Right.
You know,
if they were stealing fish.
Right. And then, but the thing about the trees is like, well, these people also didn't have the choice to adopt a tree-based life.
Right.
So they had to, poor people of the Northwest, they had to live off of copious salmon instead. Yeah, okay.
And they had to rush headlong into enslaving other people.
Right. Maybe, so that would be the materialist, like determinist kind of way of reading it, potentially.
Right. But what the Davids leave out about the Californian array of choices and what might be determining that partially is that there are some other things about their lifestyle that are connected to acorn/nut appreciation being a big part of their culture.
Yeah.
And it's that, for one thing, they were very nomadic and they preferred a nomadic life where they had different, we talked about the wild tending in the one episodes. And so moving around, foraging and tending stands of wild plants, preferring some other than others. They had a very like seasonal movement. A lot of the different groups of people, they were moving around and had, changed the diet accordingly, but also they would cache their acorns and nuts all around. Now you could cache smoked fish. It might be less stable. And that's one factor that the Davids don't talk about, which is that it's much harder to store fish the warmer it is. So the further south you move on the coast, the less capacity you actually even have to store fish.
Because they'd spoil in storage.
Because they would spoil in storage.
Yeah.
So that's important.
Right.
As a reason why you might choose to not have that be your main source of food. But also if you're moving around and caching your food, if you don't always go back to your caches, squirrels are not the only people who lose their nut caches,
Yeah.
And so it would be a much bigger loss if you put a bunch of front-loaded effort into your fish and then didn't make it back to that stored amount.
Right.
Than it would be if you didn't make it back to your acorn stash.
Right. Yeah. And that's like that paper that they cite in the chapter, the like Tushingham or whatever it's called paper. This is one of the arguments that they make in there, right? Is that utilizing nuts primarily allows you to kind of just cache some here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
And then it enables you to keep a nomadic lifestyle
Right.
or like a semi-nomadic lifestyle. Because if you move away from a cache and you end up going over here and you never come back to it, it's not that big of a loss. Right. But having to front load the resource and dry and smoke all the fish and stuff incentivizes you to like stick near where you've stored it.
Yeah, for sure. And also, smoked fish is just smellier. It's probably more prone to predation from other animals.
Oh,
like all of that. It doesn't have to just be humans who are looting you. Like, I mean, we live in the woods, so we have other animals encroaching and taking our food all of the time if we leave it out. But
they've got those big bears in California.
Oh yeah, those beautiful big bears. Mm-hmm. They would definitely love to find your salmon cache. You know,
they have good noses.
They probably would like your acorn and pine nut cache as well. But so. We should cite the anthropology that's informing part of what I'm saying definitely in the show notes, because I definitely didn't come up with all this on my own or something. But yeah, the Tushingham paper is definitely one of them. But there are observations that we know they read and even cited that talk about all these other factors.
Right. And didn't someone else point out that there are just a lot fewer fish in the rivers?
There are a lot fewer
when
fish.
You go south from the Pacific Northwest sphere.
Yeah.
And also that I think that the fish in the California rivers, like the salmon in the California rivers, it's less all at once.
Yes.
Right? It's more, I don't know why this would be, if it's the different species that are involved or what it is. If anyone knows about this, write us, because I'm curious about this. But that like the salmon are present in like more months out of the year in the rivers. And so that seems like that would be a material consideration that is important, that you don't have to like all be ready, the whole squad and just all hands on deck to just get them in this one time and do it all at once, that you can kind of pull them out when you want them or when you need them.
There would be less need for preservation too, I think that all of that is important as we talk about why you would choose acorns, and that it's not just a cultural choice, probably. It's not only about wanting to be different from another group of people. I mean, I'm not saying that's not a factor, and I think they're correct that schizmogenesis is a major factor in cultural choice and societal organization, but also there are actually a lot of reasons that they liked acorns and nuts that don't have to do with just wanting to be different.
Right.
And, I just want to add here from personal experience, acorns are tasty. You can make a lot of different things with them. They're more versatile than fish, actually. You can do different things with them.
Yeah.
And also, they talk about the back-breaking labor of leaching and grinding is definitely labor-intensive, but a lot of leaching is actually passive. Like, you can put big caches of acorns in a cloth, in a like net, in a stream of fresh water, which there's so much amazing fresh water where we're talking about, and the water itself leaches the acorns,
Is that how they did it?
That's one way. You don't have to. There's many ways to do it, but that's one way that they did it and do it.
Okay.
And so
I've learned a little bit about leaching acorns, like the way people who are doing it now do it, but
totally.
But historically, I actually don't know.
Yeah, there is actually some pretty passive leaching that can happen.
Yeah,
so, especially if you're mobile.
Yeah.
And moving around, you can come back and get them.
It is kind of funny how they're always like the back-breaking work of grinding. Like they really want you to think it's, cleaning fish is no treat either, I guess, if it's like a huge pile of fish that the clock is ticking and they're just, the flies are buzzing and everything, and you've got to clean all these fish.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of work in the fish processing as well. I did want to say that when reading about the archaeology of the Californian peoples, that there has they found evidence of grinding, of like mortar and pestle type things, not that, but like a grain grinding hand stone tool that goes back to between like 5,000 and 6,000 years before now in San Francisco Bay. And I just thought that was really cool, that there's evidence of that being an important food staple and being ground in a specific way, like that far back, which is just cool.
Yeah.
So, that's just kind of a wrap up of like the stuff that's being left out here. But what I did want to say is that I think that one thing, they're not highlighting this because they don't want to reduce people's choices to their way of life. But we do know from earlier in the book that when they talk about the freedoms that allow people to self-determine, one of them is the ability to leave. That the nomadic cultures they talked about from prehistory had that freedom more, you know? And so they haven't argued against the fact that moving around might make things easier as far as self-determination and autonomy goes.
Right.
And so I just think it's interesting because these folks were able to find a way of life where they could eat really well, eat a lot of kinds of things, had dense populations, but they moved around all the time, you know? And yes, they were cultivating some sacred plants and they were wild tending everywhere they went, but they were able to hold on to that one freedom.
Right.
You know, partially through movement.
Right.
And we talked about earlier in the season how if you know how to move around and support yourself, you automatically have more freedom because you can leave the group you're traveling with at any point. You know? So it's interesting to me because even if we want to keep the argument, which I think that they make a good case for, that some level of difference between the Californians and the Pacific Northwesterners has to do with schismogenesis.
Yeah.
And defining each other in relief, like one way to prevent accumulation of power and hierarchy these people may have figured out was to stay nomadic, you know?
Yeah.
Which their diet allowed them to do.
Their food choice allowed them to do. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. But that's like exactly what the Davids not wanting to talk about. Yes. Am I right? That this is like part of what they're trying to...
Yes.
Because I get lost sometimes in all of this. I'm like, which elements of these stories are they critiquing and which elements are they affirming? And just remind me, so is there a slavery domination angle to this whole part of the chapter at all?
No.
There's not. They're just talking about another way that these people were different from each other. It's like before it was, here's one way, slaves, no slaves. Here's another way, fish, nuts. And they're trying to say that the material explanations for fish versus nuts are inadequate, and we just have to use a schismogenetic explanation for fish versus nuts.
Well, so actually they do get to slavery here at the end of the section.
Okay.
Not very many paragraphs, because we're going to come back to this more in the conclusion.
Yeah.
Big time. But, you know, the question that's coming for all of us, if we don't want to think that it's just that an abundance of fish means you have slaves, or you decide that you need to have slaves,
right,
is why did these people capture them? Why did they capture people? Why was that a major part of their economy? And why were their lives built upon that institution? Because they absolutely were, again, as long back as people could remember, there was not a time before that. Yeah. As far as the record goes.
Right.
But this is where we get back into what you were talking about earlier, which is that there's this creation of a class of people. They don't repeat that exact thing here, but they talk about how for the aristocracy in the Northwest, you could go hunt manatee, you could like kill some whales, but like it was very below one's class level to fish, build weirs, like any of the stuff that would be related to that anadromous fish harvest.
Right.
You were not supposed to do that. And for reasons that we're going to maybe get into, or lack of reasons we're going to get into more in the conclusion part, the aristocrats did not have the power to force their commoners to do so. They didn't get to just order the normal people, the people who are not aristocrats, to do the fish labor.
So let's, like, for the sake of simplification, let's say that these cultures in the Pacific Northwest had 3 strata.
Yes.
There was the royalty or the elites.
Yes.
There was the commoners, and then there was the slaves.
Right.
And the commoners were free in the sense that they could move and go join the town of some other clan.
Right.
And so if the elites tried to force the commoners to be like, get more fish, like you really have to work and do this fish, y'all, then like they could be like, you're driving me too hard, and then just leave and go live in someone else's household, you know, like a household of like 200 people.
Right.
And so they couldn't really compel them in this way.
Right.
And but you could compel the enslaved people.
Right.
Right. And so, I remember this part where this is where the Davids come in and they say like, well, okay, so we can't explain slavery just because of fish harvest.
Right.
still, that's a little bit unclear to me. But like,
Right.
we can't explain it just on this. So here it turns out to be, voila, the real explanation. The real explanation is that slavery existed in the Northwest, but not in California, because in the Northwest, you had these elites who could not compel their commoners to work. And so they needed enslaved people to bring the fish in.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which to me really feels like a very flimsy explanation.
Well,
Because it
Yeah.
presupposes an entire power relations.
I guess it's hard to figure out how you get to a place. How do they get
Right.
there? There's just a lot of steps skipped along the way
Yeah,
to
right.
this outcome
Yeah,
that we're all curious about.
right.
You know, how do you get to a place where you can't control your
Yeah,
your,
right.
your
That's what
your
I'm
peasants
saying.
yet, you know?
Yeah, it presupposes all of this, that there's like, should be an explanation for that.
Right.
How do you get to a place where there's an elite echelon with commoners, right? I mean, there's something to talk about in
Mhm.
what they're pointing out, for sure, but I don't know if it just like stands as like, oh yes, now we have the answer.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that maybe with all of this presented, it's time to like wrap up the chapter by talking about their conclusion and some of the observations that we have about that.
Right. Okay, so before we get to the conclusion wrap up part of the chapter, which we have a lot to say about,
Yeah. A lot of thoughts.
a lot of thoughts, I want to spend just a moment talking about the penultimate section of this chapter, which is about the borderlands sort of between the Pacific Northwest culture and the Californian, like more like strictly Californian culture.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an area that sort of like the first ethnographer to study California's indigenous populations, Alfred Kroeber, calls the Shatter Zone. So this is sort of the Northwest area that borders what is the Pacific Northwest culture
Mm-hmm.
and then the Californian area. So there's like this area that's pretty strongly Californian culture-wise,
Yeah.
but things are a little bit different there.
Mm-hmm.
Kroeber called it the Shatter Zone because there were so many language groups, so many like different cultures within that area, different groups of people.
Right.
It was like I guess that means like it's shattered, like there's a lot of pieces to it.
Yeah, or like when you look at the map
Oh yeah.
of Northwest California and then have each indigenous people on the map with their territory,
Yeah.
then it's like all of a sudden the puzzle pieces get really small
Right.
and very numerous
Yes.
right in that part. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So this is a pretty interesting place for an ethnographer to study because there are so many different peoples interacting with each other.
Yeah.
Right. And probably was a really interesting place to live because you would come in contact with many people of different languages and ways of being nearby.
Mm-hmm.
What the Davids want to draw attention to here within the Shatter Zone is that this is where you see a lot more evidence of cultural schismogenesis or of societal formation and organization that is in reaction to their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
because within this zone, there were more tribes with built-in institutions that would prevent slavery from becoming a foundational part of society. And so while in California, there was almost like not even, they didn't have slaves, but there were less obvious nods to the fact that they could have slaves.
Right. It seems like they were giving less thought to the
to the process.
To the process too. Yeah.
In this shatter zone, in these borderlands, then there were institutions that were designed to keep you from keeping slaves. Like, for example, the Yurok people, if you captured someone in battle, you actually had to pay off their family or their tribe like you would if you killed someone.
Yeah.
So that makes the win kind of a lose type situation. Like, you take a loss if you take someone.
Right.
They also had a lot of oral traditions around slavery or around people who were slavers as bad guys. There were stories of revenge. This part is all very fascinating, and if you're interested in this ethnography, I do recommend reading this part of the book, because the legends in their culture, in some of the cultures of this shatter zone that refer to a previous history of slavery that led to revenge and consequences that is part of the local stories there, is really interesting. But also, they just had heroes who would be people who overthrew slavers and were very self-sufficient and proud of not needing other people to do their work for them. Like, this was built into the ethos in a way that was very dramatically contrasted with the people of the North.
Yeah.
Who they saw as slothful and greedy and needing people to work for them. And also here in the Shatter Zone is where their clown culture was based around making fun of people who ate a lot and were slothful and lazy.
Yeah.
So these visions of excess were portrayed in their culture as other. And so then you can really see this process of schismogenesis as defining who we are. It's who we are not, which we mentioned already. And I wanted to draw attention to this again, even though we already talked a good amount about the cultural differences on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Because I think of that, as we've already mentioned, the David's contribution of examining schismogenesis as a factor in societal organization as a pretty strong determining factor is one of those stronger contributions of the book. And in this part, they make some really good examples or make a good case for this conscious differentiation.
Yeah.
This looks like agency. This looks like it's not accidental that these people did not have slavery in the same way as it happened further north.
Yeah.
Even though, because they're getting further north, they do have more access to those big fish runs, and anadromous fish storage is easier, and all of the things that would be somewhat determining factors of how much you could have a lifestyle with a lot of excess fish.
And because they're geographically closer, it's maybe potentially more of an influence.
Absolutely.
Yes. Like some people are looking over the fence and going, wow, look at the leisure class that they get to have with all those slaves or something.
Sure.
Not that it's like compelling for everybody, but it's just, it's kind of in your face more maybe.
Yeah. So. And you have to address that.
Yeah.
And these people seem to have created institutions to offset that influence. Right. And so I feel like they do a really good job in this section of making the case for that as a factor. And it points to something that you brought up earlier, which is that, or have brought up with me personally earlier, which is that their positive examples are their strengths.
Right. By their positive examples, we mean when they are arguing for the inclusion of another kind of explanation or another way of seeing things, like in this case, the schismogenesis, they give all these pretty compelling, I think, arguments for schismogenesis, happening. We can see the traces of it, like we can see the traces of a self-conscious defining in opposition to a neighboring culture. And I think that is all very compelling. I think that what they often do less well is arguing against the differing explanations,
Yeah, I think that those arguments tend to be a little shakier and hastily done, it feels like. I don't know, maybe that's not the case. And I think because they maybe feel strongly about those as being self-evident, they do less to demonstrate those arguments. I might be wrong about that.
The negative arguments, they feel like are self-evident.
It feels that way to me,
right.
because they'll make like kind of like sketch something and then be like, well, we proved this.
Yeah, I think that maybe they imply that they're self-evident.
Right.
And
that's the work.
They hope that that's good enough.
That's the convincing. Yeah. The work of convincing is done that way. But anyway, back to the Shatter Zone part. They do a good job here of providing more examples of the schismogenesis as a factor in these cultures determining themselves. And also that the way, I don't know, it's interesting because some of those choices that are made seem to have a huge impact on how people define themselves individually. Mm-hmm. within these cultures. And so while the aristocrats in the Northwestern cultures are more likely to be like, we show our status by not working.
Yeah.
You know, the folks in the Shatter Zone, the Californians that are there in that borderland, have a ethos around hard work, wealth too, but in a different way that we might think of wealth. Mm-hmm. But hard work proving that you're a person. This is why they were compared to Puritans in some ways.
Oh,
but
yeah.
also that they have these rituals involving sweat lodges where you have to climb the mountain and gather wood from the top of the mountain for the sweat. Mm-hmm. It's very hard work, but doing the work makes you human. It makes you a real person in their group. Mm-hmm. And the world becomes more real as you do this work. It's very beautiful the way this part is conceived by those folks. And also that, I don't know, it's interesting, like work builds character, right? You know?
Yeah.
While leisure proves status in the other culture. And so you see this juxtaposition gets very loud in these examples.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that I think is really interesting and has caused me a lot of thought is how Graeber and Wengrow, they always talk about these processes of like a culture or like a people self-determining,
right.
You know, like we're going to have purifying sweat lodges instead of like grease feasts or whatever, and we're going to, all of these contrasts. To them, this is always the result of a process of conscious deliberation, you know, and they always use this terminology of like self-conscious deliberation or like that it's evidence of arguments for and against certain ways of living. And at the risk of maybe splitting hairs too much or like unhelpfully, I think this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. I really do wonder, when they talk about things in this way, I'm always picturing that they're imagining like people sitting around a campfire.
Or like at a communal center for like arguing.
Yeah, like something. The setting is not really important, but that it's like a circle of people basically being like, well, what do you think about having so many masks in our ritual? You know, like maybe less masks or whatever. Right. And that they're having, you know, but I'm not sure if this is exactly what they mean, but they use these words that imply kind of like a democratic assembly, like conscious argumentation for and against, and because this is like being a self-conscious political actor, right? But I guess part of what I wonder is how much human agency actually involves deliberation of this explicit kind. Like in the last episode, we were talking about schismogenesis between punks and hippies. Did the original punks actually originate their movement by like talking about their hippie precedents and like what was lacking in that and like how they could form themselves in a way that was different in this process of like self-conscious deliberation? Right. I guess I'm just like thinking about this because I know from just like observing the world and from personal experience that sometimes like the reason why we made these certain choices or broke off in a certain direction is more clear to us in retrospect and not so much because we were like consciously making rational decisions about it every step along the way. You know, that maybe just, oh, there's like a door that opens and it's an opportunity and you take it because circumstances kind of pull you in that direction in some way. And then maybe in retrospect, you look and you're like, well, it's right that I broke off from that thing that I was doing before because of such and such a reason. But maybe you didn't even have all the reasons while you were. And I guess I'm extrapolating that to this bigger thing that has to do with cultures. But do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. Well, there's just so many theories of change, and a lot of big change that happens or cultural decisions that are made sometimes happen very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there are environmental factors. Sometimes there's an outer catalyst, like a pressure from another group or something like that. There's so many different ways that we decide what we decide, and sometimes we don't even realize we made a decision until afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying,
right.
Is that you'll look back and be like, I guess this is when this kind of fell apart, or I guess this is when we started doing things differently, but we never really talked about that.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that most of us experience that in our regular lives is also true of some cultural change,
Yeah, what's true for our individual lives is maybe also true of collective
societal
shifts,
lives
as well. Yeah, and this actually reminds me of, I was just reading this really fascinating article from the journal EndNotes, and it was by Jasper Burns. It was called Revolutionary Motives. I can link to it because I found it online. And it relates to what we're talking about because the article is specifically about what motivates people to rise up.
Right.
What motivates people to make a break, to make a revolution, to make an uprising? Because if we would like to see that happen in our world, maybe it would be good to have kind of an understanding of what motivates people to get into the streets, And part of the argument of the piece is that it's not always easy or possible to know exactly what's going to get somebody out there. That people come to historical opportunities or ruptures from all different kinds of directions, not always as part of a self-conscious or deliberative process.
Right.
And part of what he talks about in the article is, there is a tradition on the left that insists that part of the work of revolutionary leadership is like consciousness raising, right? To go out and kind of like proselytize to the masses and like tell them, teach them about like how they're oppressed, like what they can do about it, what action could look like or whatever, right? And that's to try and to really get the people into a self-consciously deliberative mode. Right, to actually like get people thinking and talking about the politics and the stakes and all of this, right? But part of what Jasper Burns acknowledges in the article is that uprisings and revolutions are only partially the result of people who are thinking self-consciously about the political implications of it all.
Right.
And that the deliberating part where people are like, how about this? Or how about this way? Or like, no, let's not do this. Let's do the other thing is more of a feature once the revolutionary process is already underway. Like in Egypt, people rose up, they took over Tahrir Square, they started the occupation, and then the meetings began. I mean, there were people who were having meetings before, but in mass, that's when the self-conscious deliberation started, So anyway, none of this is contradicting, I think, what the Davids are offering here. I think that, in fact, they would really like the place that I'm taking this because I think that they would appreciate this type of nuance. But there's like, part of what this gets at is a form of action where sometimes you lead by doing instead of by talking.
Right.
Not that leadership is exactly what the question is here, but it is a question of like how we collectively make moves.
Right. I don't know. I keep having this thing go through my head, which I just want to mention briefly here. And it's that I saw, you were there. That performance we were at Idapalooza one year. Were you there for that Annie Danger's performance?
Oh, yeah, totally.
And Annie Danger did a sort of like motivational speaker type.
It was kind of a parody, sort of like a motivational speaker.
Right.
But also it had real content.
And it had, absolute real content.
Like the style was a parody, but the content was serious.
Yeah, so the style was in the style of a motivational speaker who's like getting you to like claim your own power or actualize yourself, like whatever, like be an effective person type talk or something. But then the point was about collective power and seizing the moment. Yeah. And she talked about having interviewed different elders who were in the Harvey Milk riots. And that they talked about how, so the Harvey Milk riots are when the guy who killed Dan Brown, was that his name? The guy who assassinated Harvey Milk Maybe that's not his name. Anyway.
Something White. I think.
Yeah, Dan White. I think his name was Dan. I don't know why I think that.
Right.
Like,
Sure.
A different color.
Let's call him Dan White.
Anyway, whatever. The assassin, Harvey Milk's assassin,
Yeah.
was let go for, like basically like a little slap on their wrist
Yeah.
for assassination.
Right. And there were riots after that.
And there were these riots after that, and in Annie's retelling of the firsthand testimony of people who were participants, they talked about there being a moment. There's a moment with people on the street where they all just looked at each other and knew what to do next.
Yeah.
There was a consensus gained through just like eye contact.
Uh-huh.
And then the shit just went off.
Yeah.
And they started setting shit on fire and breaking shit and saying we're not dealing with this anymore. That wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then just to finish up, Annie had brought all these rocks.
Yeah.
And put them on the stage, and at the end of the talk, invited everyone to come up and get a rock
Yeah.
to smash some windows with.
Yeah, that's
And it was so cool. It was one of the more powerful performances I ever saw.
That was really, really well done.
Yeah, it was so well done.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really speaks to, this like non-deliberative moment where people act collectively to do something different.
Right.
To make a break.
Right.
To seek another possibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, post-riots, there were probably a lot of meetings and talks.
Yeah.
For moving forward,
Right.
And same, Stonewall, also a riot. This is June, so we could also say that. Like, that was a no fucking more moment.
Right.
And there were definitely meetings before and after that.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
And maybe this can be part of the theory of Pacific Coast schismogenesis that Graeber and Wengrow are trying to propose here, where, maybe this is like completely hypothetical, but you can imagine like maybe in the Shatter Zone, there was a more oppressive form of slavery being practiced, and there was something that was more like a spontaneous revolt against that, or a situation that got out of control. And that was the break. And then after the break came the deliberation and the self-conscious arguments that eventually solidified into another way of life.
Right.
Right. So this is not against Graeber and Wengrow here. It's just like looking a little closer at like what do these like self-conscious deliberations inside these schismogenetic moments, what do they actually consist of? More, or like what is the sequence of events actually? And like I said, this is all hypothetical. We're just wondering.
Well, yeah, and you're leading us kind of into the conclusion, actually.
Yeah.
Because once they get into the conclusion to talk about what they've described and what ideas are they taking from that, at the end of the chapter, they talk about how conceptual frameworks that have to do with cultural differentiation tend to be along a spectrum. And either on one end, there's like strongly materialist, determinist, which they kind of, honestly, they call most environmentalist predictions determinist in the book. But anyway, but they are in this part throwing critics a bone and saying, we acknowledge that there's an extreme version of that. And then on the other end, they're saying that there are the people who are just like, culture just kind of arises. Like the English are English because they're English. And the Chinese are the Chinese because they're Chinese, and it's like that's
the kind of extreme post-structuralist relativism in academia that uses language and the more sort of disorganized differentiations of linguistic shift as like the model for like all of culture and all of life a little bit. Yeah.
Actually, the way that you say it that way, which that is what they're talking about. It's almost like on one end we have like material determinism, and then on the other end we have either like abstract or idealist determinism.
Yeah. Or something that's like basically arbitrary. But also not
flexible.
And not determined by the people. Who are the subjects.
Who are performing it.
Language speaks us. I'm not sure what that is a quote of, but there's this like post-structuralist inversion, which is like, we don't speak language. Like, we're not wielding the tool of language. Actually, we are the tool of language. So then it makes people into like an object more of like a bigger process that is culturally mappable, but is not something that we are directing. or in the driver's seat there.
Right.
So what the Davids are doing in this part is that they're like, yeah, there's two forms of non-agency that we need to acknowledge, and to acknowledge that they have a grain of truth in them, but we are trying to carve a third way. And material determinism is one form of saying that people don't have agency. And then this maximal post-structuralist relativism is another way that we don't have agency.
Right. And so they want to claim a spot for self-determination of societies.
Yeah.
Partially through drawing on this idea of like deliberation and conscious active participation in organization. Right.
Right. Yeah. And the thing that, like, I've pointed this out before, and I'm just going to say it again, because I think it's the thing that's always lacking in their attacks on materialism, is that they love to talk about the aspect of materialism that says that we are constrained by material conditions, and that material conditions form some, tend to channel our possibilities, but they never talk about the aspect of materialism where it's possible to change our material conditions.
Yeah.
Material conditions can be changed.
And sometimes have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Right.
I mean, some material conditions are not very changeable. Like, you're not going to change a mountaintop into a coastline, but you can change the form of economy that we are embedded within.
Right.
These types of material conditions are within our power to change. Right. And so it's not one way. They like to talk about the materialist view as if it's just material conditions acting on us. That's all. It's one way, instead of us acting on material conditions as well.
Yeah, and actually I hadn't thought about it this way until now, but the way that the discourse they're laying out here can sometimes feel like divorced from, like, humans as divorced from their ecology, and separate from it. I don't know, what you're getting at kind of informs that, because if you see people as separate and alienated from their environs, then they are not participating in it and with it, but it's acting on them.
Yeah.
But if you actually see people as part of their environs, as co-creators and whatever you want to call that, ecosystem managers, there's all these kinds of weird terms for that, but like as co-creators and relations of their surroundings, then you can't act like it's just something that happens to you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that is the ecological sense of material conditions, right? Which is a very important sense. But I also want to make sure that we're also talking about the
societal part,
the chosen economy, as a material condition, right? Like we talked about nomadic pastoralism as a material condition that encourages patriarchy. Back in episode 3. And, nomadic pastoralism is not something that is just like forced upon some people, right? I mean, they might be encouraged into it by some other material conditions, but, we always have some amount of agency over like how we're going to make our living in whatever environment we happen to be inhabiting. Yeah, so they're positioning themselves in this part as the maybe somewhat more reasonable and more freedom-loving alternative to these two other poles that they think both have a grain of truth to them, but that they are like basically critiquing, if for no other reason than that they rob us of our agency in their eyes. But it is kind of funny because in this conclusion, they have a couple paragraphs where they become suddenly magnanimous about the materialist view, at least like acknowledging that there's a grain of truth to the fact that we don't always make history under conditions of our own choosing. In fact, they quote the quote from Marx that I delivered in episode 3 is almost verbatim. It appears almost verbatim in this chapter, where they're reflecting in this very kind of elevated way, as if they've like scaled a mountaintop and they're like looking out on the whole scene that they've just been traversing. They're reflecting on like how much history can actually teach us about human agency and to what extent it's present or absent. And then they throw in this Marx quote where they say, perhaps Marx said it best, where we make our own history, but not under conditions of our own choosing. And when I read this time, I was like, maybe it's actually in this book that I learned that
Probably.
quote. It's possible, you know, even though I said it kind of contra Graeber and Wengrow back in episode 3. And so it's funny that here it is, like they're saying it approvingly in this part. So whatever, that's all very funny. And it's funny that they're, what did you say, throwing a bone or whatever? They're like throwing a bone to the more Marxian materialist kind of analysis that like, yeah, perhaps it's true that we act within a reality and we don't have like full freedom, you know, right? But what they conclude is that since there's no objective way to know to what degree we are actually constrained versus having freedom and agency, that where you set the dial, and these are their words exactly, where you set the dial between freedom and constraint is largely a matter of taste. And that therefore, since they are interested in freedom, it makes sense to set the dial further in the direction of freedom.
Right.
You know, so they are stating that their methodology of telling history is going to be one in which freedom is assumed as a matter of taste.
You know, before I respond to that directly with a quote from Scheidel, I just wanted to say that it's interesting to hear you say it back right now, what they're doing in this part.
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, when you read this part, if you're us and have been looking closely at the text, unlike the first time I read it when I was just water skiing along for the ride and enjoying myself.
Yeah.
I was like, well, holy shit, here we are. They're actually acknowledging this situation, you know, and you know, many episodes ago, you were like, they could have just come out and said, this is what we're doing.
Right.
We could do it this way or this way, but we're doing it this way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some people who already read this very closely were like, yeah, they do that in chapter 5.
Right.
Anyway, but anyway.
With still half the book ahead of them. Or more than half the book,
right.
Yeah.
So, yes, they did do that. And here...
Thank you guys. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
You know,
yeah, for just coming out
unfortunately, most of the people in your field were already, like, had burnt the book by this point because they're so angry. But anyway, we would have loved it in the first chapter. We didn't get it in the first chapter. Anyway, honestly, those people would have probably been irate no matter what. So I'm acting like it's for them. But for the rest of us, we could have used a little bit of context at the beginning.
I really keep foreseeing things that are going to happen later in the book.
Yeah.
It's almost like I've read the book already.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's like you're psychic.
But yeah, go ahead with
But so in response to this like matter of taste thing and like, you know, we don't even really know. We could just set the dial wherever. Let's choose freedom. Why wouldn't you choose freedom?
Yeah.
Which makes like... I don't know. It also just makes the people that they have issues with, the materialist and the idealist, the far idealist, because they're more firmly in the idealist camp, I would say. You know, they make it seem like they're just like, I'm going to choose absolutely no choice. That's my choice. You know, like, I'm going to frame this as if we have no, like, it's all predetermined.
Automatons.
We're your automatons. You know, that's the choice of the materialist.
Automaton version of history.
Which they at least acknowledge there is a spectrum of that instead of just calling them all one thing, which is what they do in most of the book. Anyway, Walter Scheidel, whose piece, Resetting History's Dial, the critique of this book that we mentioned a few episodes ago. In response to setting the dial further to the left, as they say, which I also thought that was kind of funny. The left is toward freedom. Yeah, but...
I like it.
Yeah. He says, but is it true that the balance of freedom and determinism in shaping the course of history is, quote, largely a matter of taste? One would think that it is something else entirely, namely one of the greatest intellectual challenges of all, to find ways to gauge, as best we can, where the balance lies. That it might never be possible to accomplish this to everyone's satisfaction is a far cry from giving up in advance and declaring it largely a matter of personal preference.
Right. Yeah. So what Scheidel is proposing is that it's not a matter of taste. It's a matter of scholarship and debate that'll probably never be settled, but that is still worth undertaking.
Right. I do want to say one thing though, and that in response to this, which, you know, I think that they're trying to say we can do both and thinking here, but I don't think they're always very effective at that or try
Right.
very hard to do
Right.
both and, really. But I am grateful that this part is here.
Yeah, I've thought about all of this a lot because, I mean, obviously it gets right to the heart of the choices that they've made in telling the story, the new history of humanity in the way that they have. And obviously, writers and intellectuals who want to see us change the world,
Mm-hmm.
who want a better world, and think of themselves as contributing to the process of the creation of a better world and of the overthrow of the hell world.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what they want to convey is that we can do it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Is that we can do it because there's a lot of reasons to look out on the
Mhm.
hellscape and just to be very demoralized
Mm-hmm.
about our chances.
Mm-hmm.
But there is always this tension,
Mm-hmm.
or there can be this tension between, telling it like it is, describing the situation accurately
Right.
and adequately accounting for the conditions in which we have to operate, but still conveying that there's a way out, that we can
Mhm.
do it. And for a lot of books, for a lot of interviews that you might listen to that are about current events, that are about climate crisis, that are about ecological collapse, that are about the political situation, most of what we're given is an analysis of the terrible situation that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And then the what are we going to do? We can do it is kind of like the last chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We have a friend in common who actually calls this the last chapter syndrome in books or whatever, or has, almost as if it's a pathology or something to like end on the optimistic note,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, here's all this shit, but you know what? We can do it, right? And the Davids want to tell us that we can do it too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that part of what is kind of interesting about their methodology is that they're not just saving the we can do it for like the call to action that is
Mhm.
going to happen in the last chapter. It's actually, they're making it so the we can do it message influences the way that they're telling
Mm-hmm.
all the different stories of history. They're setting the dial
Right.
so that the actual interpretation of whatever they're looking at needs to comply with the we can do it message,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's kind of a novel thing
Mm-hmm.
that you don't usually see.
Not with a history of this size and scope, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because maybe a shorter...
With like the whole history of humanity.
Right. Maybe like a shorter missive might be like the whole
Mhm.
book is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually you're pointing to something I was thinking about when we were talking about those moments of action and doing instead of talking about it first,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about how a lot of theories of change have to do with like the revolutionary moment, like this like this rupture, this thing that allows, this disturbance that allows change. And
Yeah.
and even when we study ecosystems, we know, as we talked about in a couple seasons ago, that
Mhm.
that there's often like a massive disturbance that leads to a rebirth and a reorganization
Yeah.
in different systems, and I think
Mhm.
a lot of us we can see how generative these moments are and have been in history, and we might look to those
Mm-hmm.
on the ground and to be part of them and be excited about when they're happening around the world, right?
Yeah.
As moments of change, even though they're often co-opted or lead to something else terrible,
Yeah.
that all happens. But I have to say, like, as probably most listeners can tell, as we've talked about this book, like, I go back and forth with being annoyed and frustrated with the way the book is written
Mm-hmm.
and with some of the choices that are taken with the sloppy demolition that we described
Yeah.
in another episode. But I feel like there were moments more in this chapter, partially through the end, that I had more sympathy with the strategy, with
Yeah.
the we can do it chapter being the whole the whole book,
Yeah.
which is partially because I sense what is not said out loud in this book
Mm-hmm.
is that we are at a crisis point.
Yeah.
Well past a crisis point. We've been in a crisis point for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, our lived lives, my lifetime, has been a crisis point
Mm-hmm.
in which the world ultimately could be destroyed as it is right now. Not the planet, but, life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
is hurtling towards the abyss under the auspices of this economic system of domination that it's hard for us to imagine our way around and a way out of.
Yeah.
And when I think of that as being the subtext of this project, it can make more sense to me that they're just like, we're going to be the rupture. We're going to demolish the foundation of thinking that keeps us from thinking we can do anything different. Even though people aren't going to like that. We're going to just bring in the wrecking ball. You know, we're tired of waiting for those little cracks of light that come through the edifice that show us ways of being, that show us that the system is rotting. And the foundation that it's built upon, theoretically. We're actually just going to go ahead and knock the shit down and make a new framework that allows for possibility, that allows for change and for people to think that that change is possible. So whether or not it works because of the way that this is done,
or whether it's wise to encourage non-attention to
to conditions,
to the conditions.
Yes, what you're saying, and so that you're pointing to the limitation, which is just like, is it wise? Is it going to be effective if you just pissed off 90% of your readers or something? Probably not that many. No. Because the populist reading that's not in the Academy tends to like the book. But
the book is doing a lot of good work.
It's doing a lot of good work. It's stretching what we think is possible. That's part of the point. It may be all of the point, you know, but...
And it's introducing, like, that there's a lot of complexity to the human story that gets swept under the rug in the interest of very simplified narratives about agriculture and hierarchy and
just destabilizing that progressive evolutionary concept of organizational movement and change is important. So, like, the schismogenesis and the contribution to destabilizing the idea that societal organization is always progressive and linear, and it happens in stages of development in an evolutionary way. All of that is really important. You know, it's just that, are they actually helping people consider all of the factors we need to consider in order to rebuild? Or are they making it seem easier than it is? And are they showing possibility where there's some limitations? And by ignoring limitations, will we make a lot of mistakes?
These are all good questions. God, I have a lot more thoughts about this that we don't have time for us to share. But this is like where I could launch on a whole, or maybe where I should go off to myself and write a whole essay or something about history, about the uses of history. You know, Nietzsche has a famous essay on the uses and abuses of history for life. That's like, what is at stake in the way that we tell history? You know, and and my kind of like ambivalent, you know, part of what I've had to confront with my reactions to some of what's happening in the book is like, I've always been fed by biased histories and histories of the exceptional moments that proved that the terrible wreckage of history is not all that there has ever been. You know, like I kind of grew up on some of the histories that were written by Peter Lamborn Wilson, who wrote about the pirate utopias or the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons, and like all of these little enclaves where people could duck outside of the terrible stream of history and live like a better way of life. And those have been so important to me in feeding my imagination in a way that I recognize in Graeber. He read those books too.
He has a pirate book out now.
He has a book now about pirates. But then why is there something that makes me a little uneasy about what they're doing here, even though I love parts of it? And I think there's something that I feel ambivalent, and maybe this is where we should leave it or something, but I feel ambivalent about extrapolating from the exceptions to history, if that's what you want to call it, like extrapolating from those examples an entirely new methodology of history that like corrodes our ability to understand how the sequence of events happened and what we can learn from that, you know? And so that's something that I'm sitting with really deeply, because me and Graeber are influenced by some of the same books and ways of thinking, and obviously by some of the same goals,
right?
You know, and so it's all very complicated. But I think that you're totally right that this is a book that comes out of a place of urgency, and just like at all costs, let people know that we're not as confined as it might seem like we are, you know.
Okay, so we're almost done.
Yeah.
You guys, it's been a long ride, this chapter.
Yeah, but there's a couple more claims that come up at the very end of this chapter that are provocative claims that we want to address.
This conclusion is so dense that I almost think we could have spent 2 hours talking about the conclusion. But
right, and some of these are like Easter eggs where you're like, what is this now?
Right.
It's like really interesting and cool and like a really, you know, it's like no words.
Right.
Anyway, go on.
Well, yeah, because you're reading along and you're like, right. More schismogenesis. Oh, interesting. They actually are like making some room for materialism, kind of. But then they're just like, oh yeah, and as we have shown, domination begins at home.
Domination begins at home.
And so they are going to make the case more later, I hope. I think that they do come back to this, and it's part of the big point of their series of books I think that they had planned.
It's a refrain.
Right?
You know, I don't know if it ever really becomes an extended proof or something in the book, but it's a refrain for sure.
Yeah, so they're arguing partially when they talked about the Pacific Northwesterners enslaving people so that their aristocrats wouldn't have to work because they couldn't compel the commoners. They are tying that into the running of households and saying that domination begins at homes because enslaved people tend to be incorporated into just making the households work.
Right.
I find this a little bit confusing in this section, especially after everything that we've talked about in this chapter, because I don't think that they've made a case for domination beginning at home. It's true that those peoples, the Kwakiutl and the surrounding cultures, were all individual households, but it was more like estates, and there were aristocrats who had royalty around them and then commoners below that associated with each of the households. But the running of a household at that scale feels like it kind of stretches the meaning of the word domestic to me.
Yeah.
Because it's not a state-run thing or even a primary, I don't know, it's not like a corporation is doing this, but there's a way that it doesn't feel like household servants or something.
Well, slavery does have this like intimate aspect to it in some instantiations that they detail.
Right.
Where like in some of the Amerindian slavery from the Santos Granera book, some of the enslaved people were just the people who would, did we talk about this already? Like paint the makeup on you or do your hair or something, but also feeding and caring for. And so care work it comes up in slavery a lot. So that's like domination begins at home. It's sort of like these people are kind of like your family,
right?
But they're like a very, compromised and oppressed form of like family or something in a way. But then juxtaposed to that, it's like they are also saying they need these slaves for the bulk harvesting of anadromous fish.
Right.
Like the slaves are also they were needed to do like just normal, by normal I mean like stereotypical slavery grunt work.
Right.
Like picking cotton or whatever and planting the cotton, just the labor of the community.
Right. In fact, I mean, they did say that that the institutions seem to show up at the same time as the life being organized around the anadromous fish.
Going back to 1850 BC, that these things emerged at the same time.
So, it's not separable from that. And I'm like, is that domestic?
Yeah, that's right.
Labor? I don't understand
that part. But then they tell all this stuff that has all this, like we're talking about, all these different kinds of observations and all this evidence in it. And then they're like, well, clearly, now we can see domination begins at home.
Right. I mean...
And it does seem unearned.
Just
claim.
At this point.
It's an unearned
I'm looking forward to that
point.
claim being elaborated on, because I think from what I understand, that was a big part of what Graeber was focusing on towards the end of his life. But I did want to say that when I hear those words, what I think of is misogyny and patriarchy. you know?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, domination begins at home. These are all
Right.
patriarchal societies.
Yeah.
Like, that's where it started. Those people...
In that sense,
yeah.
I'm like, right, I'm with you.
Totally,
You know,
but
because
that's not what
patriarchy
they're
is maybe
saying.
the oldest domination.
Absolutely, yes.
Arguably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I hear that, I'm like, right, but that's
Mhm.
not what they're talking about,
Right.
you know?
And then, okay, so something that I think when I hear those words, and maybe this is totally bonkers, but is it possible for a book written by a British Gen Xer and an American that Domination Begins at Home is not a Smiths reference to the song Barbarism Begins at Home? That is about domination in the household.
Right.
It's about like child abuse, basically.
Right.
I was thinking about this because I've been listening to that Smiths song a lot after the death of Andy Rourke,
Right.
the bassist from the Smiths, a few weeks ago. And then I'm reading this chapter
Totally.
and it's like domination begins at home, barbarism begins at home.
Which is probably also a reference.
Yeah, so maybe that's a
Yeah.
reference to something older.
Right.
But actually I Googled barbarism begins
You
at
did.
home and everything I found was from the Smiths. But I mean,
There's just so many literary references in their work. Anyway, we digress, but
no, I think, okay, it's a, yes, we did digress.
I will say, yes, it's a Smiths reference. I'm ready to just say that.
David Wengrow, man.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, okay. And then there's another claim
Mhm.
that...
Another bomb dropped here at the end. Yeah.
And there's another claim here at the end where they say, well, and now after all of this, it should be self-evident that equality and hierarchy are born together,
Mhm.
that they emerge together in history
Right.
or in anthropological emergence
Right.
in a culture. They're claiming that you don't have equality
Mhm.
without hierarchy,
Right.
and kind of vice versa.
Mhm.
You know, so this is like, what? You know, like, whoa, 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 whoa. So this is another provocative claim that I mean, I know what they're saying, and their justification for this is they're saying like, okay, in Kwak society, it was a ranked society
Mhm.
where there's the elites who they call sometimes the aristocrats, and then there's the commoners, and then there's the enslaved.
Mhm.
And they say, well, the commoners are all equal to one another
Mhm.
structurally.
Right.
They are on a level plane, defined against the elites above them, right? So this is the kind of equality that they're talking about. They're talking about a formal equality, right?
Mhm.
That is how people can be equal relative to some external transcendent thing that's usually like maybe higher than them,
Mhm.
like being equal before the law.
Mhm.
Right? Like this is like a shibboleth of liberal democracy is equality before the law. Right?
Yeah. Equality before the king. That's
Equality before the king, equality under God.
Right.
These are like ideas of equality. And it helped me to understand their contempt for equality as a political principle
Mhm.
when framed in this way.
Mhm.
That equality is like being on a level
Mhm.
with something above you that you're all like equally subject to or
Right.
equally judged by,
Right.
you know? And in this sense, fuck equality. Like, I don't want any part of that.
Right.
You know, that's not like, I know I'm saying this because I've been a little bit like grumpy about their attacks on equality that happened previously in the book, but framed in this way, I get what they're saying.
Right.
You know, that when you start having ranks,
Mhm.
then you can speak of equality of people at a certain rank.
Mhm.
You know, like all the colonels in the army are structurally on a plane. They're like equal to each other.
Or
You
all
know,
the,
but
like-
but the generals are above them.
All the
right?
landholding men in Athens
Yeah, something
are
like
equal,
that. Mm-hmm.
which
You
is
know-
probably not even true, but yeah.
You know, but just to kind of represent the standpoint that I was speaking from in previous episodes, I think that it gets more complicated when you're talking about like egalitarianism
Mhm.
as an ethos that can express itself between people, where people are just like in a tribe or in, you know, a group of friends or in whatever thing are just organically looking out for power imbalances that might be emerging and seeking to undermine those power imbalances as a informal, dynamic, always ongoing like process of like trying to keep roughly level between people. That feels fine to me. You know, I feel like people do that.
Right.
And that like we can speak about that as an attempt at like equality-ish in a group. So I still have a place for that.
Right.
Even though this type of thing they're talking about, sure, I don't want that. And liberal equality, even though it might be a complicated concept, has a lot of this equality of rank.
Right.
Or like equality within ranks embedded within it. And that's part of what they're trying to dismantle here, is the normalization of liberal concepts of equality.
Right. And maybe we'll be coming back to this in the book as well.
We probably will.
We'll see. Can't make any promises.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be moving more just into embracing their freedom model.
Right.
And, you know, freedom to leave, freedom to disobey, all of these things. And so they spend less time trying to attack equality and more time just trying to embrace the freedom model.
They're done with that part of the project. Okay.
Well, if I remember right, I don't.
Clearly we don't remember a lot, except we think it's our own ideas, but it comes from later in the book. So, so that's that. I will say that I'm so excited about the next chapter, the next episode, not only because I am sick of thinking about this chapter for 2 months now, because it's taken us so long to get this out, but also because it's really cool. We're going to meet some really awesome characters from history, and I love so much of what the next chapter is about. The Gardens of Adonis.
Gardens of Adonis. In the next chapter, they do a deep dive into the origins of agriculture.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
We are there. We are going to the Fertile Crescent and adjacent lands and talking about what is the actual history of the emergence of agriculture.
Yeah.
And what were and were not the political implications of its emergence.
Yeah. It took us a while to get here, but we're here. So, until next time.
Settle down.